The man who could make or break dreams with a single word. The man whose smirk terrified millions. Simon Cowell. But what if I told you that while the world watched him judge others, his own life was quietly unraveling? What secrets lie behind the empire built on auditions, fame, and ruthless ambition? Tonight, we uncover the truth that the cameras never saw, the cracks in the crown of the king of reality television. Is the master of the stage invincible, or has the machine he built begun to turn on him? Prepare to see the story no one dared tell, a story of power, obsession, and the shocking cost of absolute control. The death that shattered everything, October 2024, started like any other month for Simon Cowell. Britain's Got Talent auditions were scheduled in Blackpool. The machine was running. The cameras were ready. And then a phone call came that changed everything. Liam Payne, the young man Simon had helped make famous as part of One Direction, was dead. He had fallen from a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires at the age of 31. The circumstances remain under investigation, but the result was immediate and devastating. One of the biggest pop stars of the last decade, a boy who had stood on Simon's stage as a nervous teenager in 2010, was gone forever. Simon canceled the Britain's Got Talent auditions immediately. For a man who had spent decades never letting anything stop production, this alone signaled how deep the blow had landed. He posted a message to social media that revealed a grief far beyond professional obligation. He wrote that he was truly devastated, heartbroken, and empty. He described Liam as kind, funny, sweet, thoughtful, talented, humble, and focused. He said he had always thought of the 5 members of One Direction as brothers. And then he wrote something that carried the weight of 14 years of consequences. Rest in peace, my friend. The post went viral in the way that only true tragedy can. Fans who had watched Simon judge thousands of performers were now watching him face a judgment he couldn't escape. But the grief brought more than condolences. It brought accusations. Former contestants began speaking publicly about the pressures they had faced, the mental health struggles that the competition machine had triggered or amplified, the system that processed young dreamers and discharged them damaged. Katie Weissel, who had auditioned alongside Liam in 2008, mentioned Simon by name in statements criticizing industry executives for prioritizing profits over people. The conversation Simon had avoided for 2 decades was finally happening, and he was at the center of it in ways he could not control or dismiss. Shortly after Liam's death, news broke that Simon was stepping down from Britain's Got Talent entirely. Bruno Tonioli would take his place. The official explanation focused on grief and the need for processing, but observers suspected something deeper was happening. The man who had spent 2 decades as the face of televised judgment was finally walking away from the spotlight he had once dominated completely. Simon attended Liam's funeral alongside his fiancée Lauren Silverman. Photographs showed a man who looked decades older than his 65 years, hollowed by a grief that no amount of fame or fortune could have prepared him to face. The era of Simon Cowell as the undisputed king of reality television was ending not with a triumphant finale, but with a funeral. When the body betrayed him, Simon Cowell's life had always been defined by control. The stage was his kingdom, the camera his ally, and the world his audience. He built empires from auditions, ambition, and an unflinching belief in his own instincts. But control is fragile, and the body, as Simon would painfully discover, has a way of reminding even the most invincible that it cannot be bent to will alone. The first real warning came on a quiet August day in 2020. The world was locked down. Even moguls like Simon had nowhere to be. There were no cameras, No shows, no schedules, just isolation, uncertainty, and the false comfort of safety. He was testing an electric bike in the courtyard of his Malibu mansion, a simple, almost mundane act of recreation. It was supposed to be harmless, a momentary thrill in a year defined by fear and limitation. But in an instant, everything changed. The bike lurched unexpectedly. Simon went over the handlebars. He landed on his back with a force that made the world blur and sent pain racing through every vertebra in his spine. In that fraction of a second, Simon's invincibility, his carefully cultivated persona of fearlessness, shattered. Yet, somehow, he summoned a determination that even doctors would later describe as miraculous. Despite the excruciating pain, he walked himself back to his bedroom before collapsing. Every step could have been fatal. A millimeter too far, a wrong movement. And Simon Cowell, the man who had commanded stages and empires, might never have walked again. X-rays confirmed the nightmare scenario. Multiple fractures in his spine, a near-fatal brush with paralysis. Surgery was unavoidable. 6 hours of meticulous work, metal rods and screws anchoring what had been broken. The man who had spent decades projecting invincible confidence was suddenly helpless. The smallest movements caused excruciating pain. Sitting, standing, even lying down required calculation, focus, and immense courage. Months of grueling rehabilitation followed, each day a reminder that the body could betray even the strongest mind. For the first time, Simon was forced to confront his own mortality in a way that no amount of money, fame, or power could insulate him from. And then, in February 2022, it happened again. A second electric bike accident, this time in London, fractured his arm and nearly tore a ligament completely. Onlookers wondered if Simon had learned anything from his first near-death experience. But anyone who truly understood him knew the truth. The bikes were never just vehicles or toys. They were arenas, small theaters, where Simon could assert control over the chaos threatening his life. In a world that was increasingly spinning beyond his grasp, these moments represented the last territory where he could prove to himself, if no one else, that he was still fearless, still untouchable. Yet, beneath the bravado, the truth was undeniable. Each accident chipped away at more than just his body. It pierced the armor Simon had built over decades, exposing vulnerability, mortality, and the limits of even the most legendary ambition. Pain, once abstract and theoretical in the boardrooms and studios where he ruled, became immediate, intimate, and inescapable. The physical fractures mirrored an internal reckoning, the realization that time and the body could not be ignored, that no empire, no stage, no talent could shield him from what is universal and unstoppable. Simon Cowell's accidents were not just headlines or anecdotes, they were warnings, a brutal lesson in fragility disguised as recreation. The man who had judged millions, who had defined success and ambition for a generation, now faced a judgment of his own. The body always tells the truth. And the truth, Simon learned, is that even kings are mortal, and even the fearless are bound by the limits of flesh. The empire that turned to dust. Simon Cowell had spent decades building an empire that seemed untouchable, a kingdom forged in talent, ambition, and ruthless precision. But as he was grappling with recovery from near-fatal accidents and the personal grief of losing close loved ones, that empire, the professional one he had controlled with an iron fist, was quietly, inexorably collapsing around him. At the heart of that empire was The X Factor, the show that had defined Simon's creative legacy for 17 years. At its peak, it had captured 17 million viewers per episode, shaping popular music and creating global stars. But television, like any empire, is subject to decay. By 2012, the ratings began their slow decline. By the final season, barely 5 million people tuned in. The format that had revolutionized talent shows was now predictable, stale, and irrelevant in a world where teenagers could become overnight sensations on TikTok without ever stepping on a stage. Simon refused to let his creation die quietly. He launched spin-offs, desperate to rekindle the magic. X Factor, Celebrity, featuring famous faces instead of unknown dreamers. X Factor, The Band, a high-stakes search for the next One Direction. Each attempt was more transparent than the last, hemorrhaging viewers and credibility with every episode. The magic that had once been untouchable was gone. By July 2021, ITV delivered the news that had been inevitable. The X Factor would not return. 17 years, 445 episodes, and countless dreams made or crushed would end not with a celebration, but with silence. But the collapse didn't stop at the show. In 2020, Simon made a bold move, buying out Sony's stake in Psycho Entertainment to take full control of his television properties. At first glance, it seemed like ultimate power, but every empire has its price. Sony retained Psycho Music, the record label responsible for launching One Direction, Little Mix, Susan Boyle, and Leona Lewis. Within months, Psycho Music was dissolved. Staff were reassigned or let go. The label that had been the backbone of Simon's empire, the arm that turned televised dreams into global stardom, ceased to function entirely. And then came the voices of the people who had once shared the throne with him. Former judges began speaking openly about the decline. Sharon Osbourne, fired and rehired multiple times over the years, laid blame squarely at Simon's feet. She argued that his constant tinkering, his obsession with innovation at the expense of stability, had drained the life from a format audiences once adored. The narrative that had lionized Simon as a visionary was slowly shifting. The world was no longer asking how he had built his empire. They were asking how it had fallen, and whether the cost of building it had finally caught up with him. Behind the headlines, the losses were more than financial. The empire had been Simon's identity, a reflection of his genius and his control over the world around him. And yet, despite all the power, the titles, and the fame, the same machinery that had made him untouchable also demanded its toll. Shows ended, labels dissolved, spin-offs failed. The king had survived the stage, the spotlight, and the cutthroat world of entertainment, but survival no longer meant triumph. It meant reckoning. And the empire that had once seemed indestructible had turned to dust, leaving Simon Cowell standing in the ruins, facing the most difficult question of his life. When the empire falls, what becomes of the man who built it? The demons he hid from the world. The physical injuries were visible and documented. The professional collapse played out in headlines, but the wounds that cut deepest were the ones Simon hid from the world for years. In 2024, he appeared on the Diary of a CEO podcast and made admissions that shocked even his closest observers. He spoke openly about his battle with depression, about a period when he felt like he was dying inside while still being forced to perform for cameras that demanded his famous brutality. The catalyst was the death of his mother, Julie Cowell, in 2015. She had been there from the beginning, watching him grow from a struggling mailroom worker into the most powerful person in entertainment. She had been his connection to a simpler time, before the persona, before the constant judgment, when he was just her son, trying to figure out who he wanted to be. Her death opened a wound that fame couldn't heal, and money couldn't touch. Simon described feeling like a clown during this period, forcing smiles for cameras, while everything inside him was collapsing. He had already lost his father, Eric, in 1999, but his mother's death hit differently. It removed the last buffer between Simon and the void he had been running from his entire career. The shows continued, the judging continued, the brutal honesty that audiences loved continued, but behind the persona, Simon Cowell was falling apart in ways that nobody was allowed to see. He started therapy during the pandemic, finally admitting to himself that he needed help. He described his first session with remarkable vulnerability, saying he sat down embarrassed and within 20 minutes felt like he had known the therapist for decades. He also revealed something that explained the careful, measured delivery people had noticed throughout his career. Simon has a stutter, not severe enough to be obvious, but present enough to create anxiety in every high-pressure moment he faced. The man who had built an empire on verbal precision, on delivering cutting remarks with perfect timing, had been fighting against his own brain the entire time. Every harsh judgment, every devastating critique, every moment of seeming effortless cruelty had required effort that audiences never suspected. The king of reality television had been performing a version of confidence that didn't come naturally, and the performance had been exhausting him for 30 years. The making of a legend. To understand how far Simon Cowell fell, you have to understand how high he climbed. Long before reality television made him a household name, long before millions feared his judgment, there was just a boy and an industry that refused to show mercy. Simon wasn't born into the spotlight. He was born into expectations. His father was a music industry executive who understood that the entertainment business doesn't raise soft men, and weakness doesn't survive past the first negotiation. Simon dropped out of school at 16. He worked in the mailroom of a record company while his father's colleagues watched to see if he would fail. His early career was defined by choices that critics mocked. While other executives chased rock bands and serious artists, Simon signed novelty acts that generated massive sales and zero respect. Robson and Jerome, the Teletubbies, Westlife. He didn't care about artistic credibility. He cared about what sold. And what sold made him wealthy enough to demand a seat at tables where he had previously been invisible. He learned to read audiences like prophecy, to understand what they would love before they knew they loved it, to see talent not as artistic merit, but as commercial potential waiting to be exploited. Then came Pop Idol in 2001, and everything changed forever. Simon wasn't supposed to be a star. He was supposed to be background noise, another industry voice offering professional opinions, but something happened when the cameras started rolling. The brutal honesty that had made him enemies in boardrooms made him a sensation on screen. He told contestants they were terrible. He crushed dreams without apology. He made people cry on national television and showed no remorse. The British public was horrified. The British public was fascinated. The British public could not stop watching. What Simon understood before almost anyone else in entertainment was that cruelty could be compelling. Audiences didn't just want to see people succeed. They wanted to see people fail. They wanted to witness dreams being crushed in real time, to see the exact moment when hope died in someone's eyes. It was blood sport disguised as talent competition, and Simon Cowell was the gladiator everyone tuned in to watch. He parlayed that insight into American Idol, which became the most watched program in American television history. He created The X Factor. He launched Got Talent franchises in over 70 countries. By 2010, Simon Cowell wasn't just successful. He was arguably the most powerful person in global entertainment. The Hollow Crown. By late 2025, Simon's life had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. The X Factor was dead. Psycho Music was dissolved. Britain's Got Talent had moved on without him. His body carried metal where bone used to be. His mind carried grief that therapy could only manage, not cure. Everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed, was either gone or diminished beyond recognition. The empire still technically existed, but it felt hollow, like a kingdom whose borders remained on maps, but whose power had long since faded. He launched a Netflix series in December 2025 called The Next Act, searching for the next great boy band in a format that felt both nostalgic and desperate. He assembled a group called December 10th, signed them to EMI Records, tried to prove that the magic was still there, that he could still spot talent and shape it into something the world would love. But the operation was smaller than the X Factor machine at its peak. The cultural moment had passed. The streaming age had different rules, different pathways to fame, different gatekeepers who weren't Simon Cowell. The industry that had given Simon everything had also taken so much in return. It had taken his health through decades of stress and accidents that nearly paralyzed him. It had taken his privacy, turning his struggles into tabloid headlines. It had taken his peace, the ability to exist without being constantly judged by the same audiences he had spent his career judging. It had taken precious time with people who mattered. And now, in the cruelest twist of all, it had taken one of his discoveries in a way that could never be undone. Liam was gone. The questions about what the machine did to young people were louder than ever, and Simon Cowell could do nothing to change any of it. Simon wasn't bankrupt in the conventional sense. America's Got Talent still featured his presence. The properties still held value. But he was hollow in ways that money could never fill, exhausted in ways that rest could never cure. The king of entertainment had given everything: his youth, his health, his peace, his relationships, and in return he received fame and fortune and the crushing realization that neither one actually mattered when faced with real tragedy. You can't buy your way out of losing someone you helped make famous. You can't use celebrity to undo whatever damage your machine might have caused. You can't negotiate with grief when it decides to collect what you owe. The truth about Simon Cowell. Here's what most people still don't understand about Simon Cowell's story. This isn't really about talent shows or record labels or even the entertainment industry itself. It's about what happens when you give everything to something that can never give you what you actually need. The industry made Simon legendary, but it couldn't make him happy. Fame brought him power, but it couldn't bring him peace. Success gave him influence over millions of careers, but it couldn't save the people he launched into a spotlight that sometimes burns those who stand in it too long. Simon said something in a rare, vulnerable moment that captures everything better than any summary could. He described feeling like a clown, dying inside while being paid to perform. That image, the most powerful judge in entertainment secretly crumbling behind his famous smirk, reveals the cost nobody sees when they watch the finished broadcast. The price wasn't just the physical toll of accidents that left metal in his spine. It wasn't just the exhaustion of maintaining a persona across decades. The real price was subtler and more devastating. It was the slow erosion of everything that made life worth living. The tragedy of Simon Cowell isn't that he got injured, or that his shows got cancelled, or even that someone he discovered died young. Those are just life, the random cruelties that visit everyone, eventually regardless of fame or fortune. The real tragedy is that he spent decades building an empire on something that might have been damaging the people who passed through it. He became king by creating a machine that processed dreams, and only now are we beginning to count the cost of what that machine did to some of the dreamers who entered it. The story of Simon Cowell doesn't end when the cameras turn off or the applause fades. Behind every judgment, every empire built on auditions and ambition, lies a truth most never see. A life weighed down by the very success he created. The industry he mastered gave him power, fame, and fortune, but it also demanded debts few could imagine. And now, standing at the edge of his own legend, the question remains: can a man who has given everything to an empire ever reclaim himself? Or is he forever bound to the rhythm of a kingdom that will not release him? What happens when the crown becomes a prison and the spotlight feels more like a cage than a stage? When ambition and mortality collide? When every choice comes at a cost, who really survives? And what does survival even mean in a world that consumes its heroes as quickly as it celebrates them? Simon Cowell built a legacy that millions envy. But the true story isn't on television. It's in the quiet moments no one witnesses, at the costs that cannot be televised. And as the lights fade on this chapter, one question lingers, echoing louder than any applause. When the empire stops giving, and the throne demands everything it still can the man who conquered it walk away? Or is he destined to remain part of the story forever?